Welcome back to another story on Infidelity Tales Lab. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Foundation of Hatred. Robert Bob Mitchell had built his empire from nothing. 43 years old, he owned Mitchell Construction and Development, a company that had transformed abandoned lots across Chicago into luxury apartments and commercial spaces. His weathered hands bore the scars of 20 years swinging hammers before he learned to swing deals instead. Standing 6'2" with steel gray eyes that could cut through excuses like a blade through paper, Bob commanded respect in every room he entered. Those same eyes now stared at the sterile white ceiling of Northwestern Memorial Hospital, his left side still partially numb from the stroke that had felled him 3 days ago. The doctor said he was lucky. Minimal permanent damage, good prognosis for recovery. But as he watched his wife Linda and daughter Amy enter his room, Bob realized luck had nothing to do with what was about to unfold. Linda, 41, had maintained her beauty through expensive procedures that Bob's money had funded. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled even for a hospital visit, her designer heels clicking against the linoleum with practiced precision. She'd married Bob 12 years ago, 6 months after his first wife, Amy's mother, had died in a car accident. At the time, Bob thought he'd found love again. Now, watching her predatory smile, he wondered how blind ambition could masquerade as affection for so long. Amy, 19 and home from Northwestern University, clutched a manila folder against her chest. His daughter had inherited her mother's kind eyes, but somewhere along the way, Linda's influence had twisted that kindness into calculation. The girl who once built sandcastles with him at Lake Michigan now looked at him like a problem to be solved. "How are you feeling, honey?" Linda's voice dripped with false concern as she approached his bedside. "The doctors say you're making excellent progress." Bob's speech was still slightly slurred, but his mind remained razor-sharp. "Better every day." "That's wonderful to hear." Linda exchanged a meaningful glance with Amy. "Actually, we brought something important for you to handle. Our lawyer, Mr. Freeman, said this couldn't wait." Amy stepped forward, extending the folder. "Dad, I brought the will for you to sign. Mr. Freeman said it needs to be notarized today." Bob's good hand remained motionless on the bed. He'd been meaning to update his will for months, but something had always come up. Now, in his vulnerable state, they were pressing him to sign documents he hadn't reviewed. The timing wasn't coincidental. "I can't," he said simply, his voice carrying the authority that had once commanded construction crews. Linda's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something cold underneath. "What do you mean you can't? It's just your signature, Bob. Amy even brought a notary. She's waiting downstairs." "I said I can't." Bob's eyes locked onto his wife's, and for the first time in years, he saw her clearly. "Not until I review everything myself." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Linda's perfectly manicured fingers drummed against the metal bed rail. Her wedding ring, a 3-carat diamond Bob had bought during better times, catching the fluorescent light. "Then I'm filing for divorce," she said, her voice sharp as broken glass. "And I want half of everything." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. Amy shifted uncomfortably, but didn't contradict her stepmother. Bob felt something dark and primal awakening in his chest. Not the weakness of a stroke victim, but the rage of a predator who'd been betrayed by his own pack. "Get out," he said quietly. "Bob, let's not be hasty." "I said get out." His voice carried the same tone he'd used to fire incompetent foremen, the same steel that had built his empire from nothing. "Tell the nurses they're not allowed back." Linda's composure cracked completely. "You're making the biggest mistake of your life, Bob Mitchell. You think you're tough? You think you built something that can't be torn down? I know where all the bodies are buried." After they left, Bob closed his eyes and let the rage crystallize into something useful. He'd survived poverty, business rivals, and economic downturns. He'd built something real from nothing but determination and ruthlessness. And now the people he'd loved most were circling like vultures, ready to pick apart everything he'd sacrificed to create. The door opened again, and Dr. Patricia Ramirez entered. A woman in her 50s with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She'd been Bob's primary physician since his arrival. But today, her expression carried something Bob hadn't seen before, concern that went beyond medical. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, closing the door behind her and lowering her voice. "You need to call the police now." Chapter 2. The Poison Truth. Dr. Ramirez pulled a chair close to Bob's bed, her hands folded tightly in her lap. 27 years of medicine had taught her to deliver devastating news with clinical precision. But this felt different, more personal, more dangerous. "Your blood work came back with some unusual results," she began, pulling out a tablet and scrolling through digital charts. "When you arrived, we ran a comprehensive toxicology panel as standard procedure for stroke patients under 50. Bob, you didn't have a natural stroke." The words hit Bob like a physical blow. "What are you saying? Someone's been poisoning you." "Small doses of digitalis. It's derived from foxglove plants. In controlled amounts, it's used for heart medication. But administered incorrectly or maliciously, it can cause irregular heartbeat, confusion, and eventually stroke." Dr. Ramirez's voice dropped to a whisper. "The levels in your system indicate this has been going on for weeks, possibly months." Bob's mind raced through the past few months. The occasional dizziness he'd attributed to stress. The irregular heartbeat he'd planned to have checked after the Morrison project finished. The morning coffee that sometimes tasted slightly bitter, which Linda had explained away with a new organic blend she'd been trying. How would someone get access to digitalis? It's not difficult if you know what you're looking for. Digitalis can be extracted from foxglove flowers. They're common in gardens. But there's something else. Dr. Ramirez hesitated. "We found evidence of digitalis in your personal effects, specifically a coffee mug that your wife brought from home yesterday. She said you preferred your own cup." The rage that had been simmering in Bob's chest exploded into white-hot fury. Linda hadn't just been planning to steal his life's work. She'd been systematically destroying his life itself. The woman who'd shared his bed, who'd kissed him goodbye every morning, had been slowly killing him. "Doctor, I need you to keep this information confidential for now. Don't put it in any records that can be accessed electronically. Don't tell the police yet." Dr. Ramirez frowned. "Bob, this is attempted murder. I'm legally obligated. Give me 48 hours. Please." Bob's voice carried a combination of desperation and authority that stopped her protest. "I need to understand the full scope of what I'm dealing with. If I call the police now, all I have is circumstantial evidence and a wife who'll claim innocence. Give me time to build a case that will stick." After an hour of heated discussion, Dr. Ramirez reluctantly agreed to a compromise. She would document everything in sealed medical records that could be used as evidence later, but she wouldn't contact authorities for 48 hours. In exchange, Bob would remain in the hospital under close supervision, and any visitors would be monitored. Alone again, Bob reached for his phone with his good hand. His fingers moved slowly but deliberately as he scrolled through his contacts. The first call went to Tommy Rodriguez, his head of security at Mitchell Construction. Tommy had served 2 tours in Afghanistan before Bob hired him 5 years ago, and his loyalty was absolute. "Tommy, I need you to do something for me, and I need you to ask no questions. Whatever you need, boss. I want complete surveillance on Linda and Amy. I'm talking about full coverage, where they go, who they meet, what they buy, who they call. Can you handle that discreetly? Consider it done. How deep do you want me to dig? All the way to China, if necessary. And Tommy, this stays between us. If anyone asks, you're handling security for the Morrison site." The second call went to Marcus Webb, his attorney for the past decade. Marcus had handled everything from Bob's divorce settlements to his business acquisitions, and his discretion was ironclad. "Marcus, I need to see you immediately. Bring everything. My will, Linda's prenup, the business incorporation documents, insurance policies. Everything. Bob, you should be focusing on recovery. Marcus, someone tried to kill me. Bring the files." The third call was the most important. Bob scrolled through his contacts until he found a number he hadn't used in years. Rick Morrison. Not the Morrison whose commercial project Bob was currently developing, but Rick Morrison, the private investigator who'd helped Bob during his Messier business disputes. Rick worked in the shadows where lawyers and accountants couldn't go. "Rick, it's Bob Mitchell. I need your particular set of skills." "Christ, Bob, I heard about your stroke. How are you holding up?" "I'm about to be a lot worse if I don't handle this right. I need everything you can find on Linda and someone she's probably involved with. I'm talking about the kind of information that can end lives." "What's the timeline?" "Yesterday." "And Rick, this is the big one. Whatever you find, I guarantee you it's going to be worth 10 times your usual fee." As Bob ended the call, he felt the familiar surge of energy that had carried him through his toughest business battles. Linda had made a critical error. She tried to kill him slowly instead of quickly. That patience, that calculated cruelty, would be her downfall. Because Bob Mitchell hadn't built an empire by being forgiving or merciful. He'd built it by being more ruthless than anyone who dared to cross him. And now, someone had crossed him in the most personal way possible. The game had changed, and Linda was about to learn that her husband hadn't survived 20 years in Chicago construction by playing fair. Chapter 3. The Web Begins. By the second day of surveillance, Tommy Rodriguez had compiled a file that would have impressed the FBI. From his rented sedan parked across from Starbucks on North Michigan Avenue, he watched Linda Mitchell laugh intimately with a man who definitely wasn't her husband. Derek Thompson, 36, owned Thompson Architectural Design, a mid-tier firm that had been struggling for the past 2 years. He was handsome in a way that suggested he'd never worked with his hands, his dark hair perfectly styled, and his expensive suit clearly financed by someone else. More importantly, Thompson had been one of the contractors Bob had fired 18 months ago for submitting inflated bids and cutting corners on the Riverside project. Tommy snapped photos as Linda and Derek held hands across the table, their body language screaming affair. But it was their conversation, captured by the directional microphone Tommy had positioned through the coffee shop's window, that would interest Bob most. "The lawyer says once the will is signed, everything transfers smoothly," Linda was saying, stirring sugar into her latte with practiced elegance. "Bob's been updating his estate planning for months. This is just the final step." Derek leaned forward, lowering his voice. "And you're certain he doesn't suspect anything about the foxglove?" "Please. Bob thinks his health problems are from stress. He's so focused on business that he wouldn't notice if I served him rat poison with breakfast." Linda's laugh was cold, calculating. Besides, even if he did start asking questions, who would believe him? A stroke victim accusing his devoted wife? It would just prove his mental capacity is compromised. Tommy's hand tightened on the microphone as Derek continued. "Once he's gone, we can merge Thompson Architectural with Mitchell Construction. Your stepdaughter won't contest anything. She's been promised enough money to keep her quiet through college and beyond. Amy was easier to manipulate than I expected. Tell a 19-year-old she'll inherit millions if she keeps her mouth shut, and suddenly she's very cooperative." Linda checked her watch. "We should go. I need to visit Bob this afternoon and play the concerned wife. The more witnesses who see my devotion, the better." Tommy followed them for the next 3 hours, documenting their stop at a high-end jewelry store where Derek purchased an expensive necklace, their visit to a real estate office where they inquired about luxury condos in Miami, and their final destination, a garden center where Linda purchased foxglove plants. Meanwhile, Rick Morrison was working his own angles. 20 years of private investigation had taught him that everyone had secrets, and the bigger the secret, the more desperate people became to protect it. By Tuesday evening, he'd assembled a profile that painted Linda Mitchell as far more dangerous than a simple gold digger. Born Linda Walsh in Cleveland, she married 3 times before Bob, and all 3 previous husbands had died young. The first, when she was 22, had supposedly committed suicide after a business failure. The second had died in a car accident after their divorce was finalized, but before the settlement was complete. The third had suffered a heart attack at 41. Leaving Linda as the sole beneficiary of his construction company, which she'd sold within 6 months of his death. More interesting was Derek Thompson's background. Before starting his architectural firm, he'd worked as a landscape designer specializing in ornamental plants. He'd been arrested twice on domestic violence charges. Both cases had been dropped when the women involved mysteriously withdrew their complaints and left town. At the hospital, Bob reviewed the files Marcus Webb had brought with growing clarity. His current will, drafted 2 years ago, left everything to Linda with a trust fund for Amy. But there was something else Marcus had discovered. Insurance policies Bob didn't remember signing, investment accounts he didn't remember opening, and a power of attorney document that would give Linda complete control of Mitchell Construction if Bob was declared mentally incapacitated. Marcus, when were these documents executed? According to the notary stamps, over the past 6 months. Your signature is perfect, but... Marcus hesitated. But what? Bob, I've been your lawyer for 10 years. You've never made a major decision without discussing it with me first. These documents represent a complete restructuring of your estate, and you never mentioned any of it. Bob studied his own signature on the power of attorney document. It was perfect, too perfect. Marcus, I need you to do something that might not be entirely legal. I'm listening. I need you to create a new will, one that leaves everything to charity and specifically excludes Linda and Amy. But I need it backdated to last year, before all these mysterious documents appeared. Marcus shifted uncomfortably. Bob, that's document fraud. I could lose my license. And if you don't help me, Linda is going to inherit everything she's been systematically stealing while slowly murdering me. Bob's voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. Your choice, Marcus. Help me save my life's work, or watch a killer inherit millions. After Marcus left, Bob made one final call. This one went to Joey Torino, a man he'd known since childhood in the old neighborhood. Joey ran what could charitably be called a private security firm, the kind that handled problems traditional security couldn't touch. Joey, it's Bob Mitchell. Bobby, Christ, I heard you were in the hospital. You okay? I'm about to be a lot better. Remember when you said you owed me for helping with your sister's medical bills? I remember. What do you need? I need someone to disappear for a while. Someone who's been causing me problems. Permanently. Bob considered the question. The old Bob might have said no, might have tried to find a legal solution. But the old Bob hadn't been slowly poisoned by the woman he loved. The old Bob hadn't discovered that his daughter was willing to help commit patricide for money. Not permanently, but I need them gone long enough for me to clean house. Can you handle that? Bobby, for you? Consider it done. As Bob hung up, he felt the last vestiges of mercy drain from his system like poison from a wound. Linda and Derek had made their choice when they decided to kill him. Amy had made her choice when she decided money was more important than her father's life. Now it was time for Bob Mitchell to make his choice. And Bob Mitchell had never been known for forgiveness. Chapter 4. The Setup. 3 days later, Bob executed the first phase of his plan with the precision that had built his empire. Sitting in his hospital bed, he called Linda with a voice full of contrition and weakness, neither of which he felt. Linda, honey, I've been thinking about what you said. About the divorce, about the will. He let his voice crack slightly, the perfect imitation of a broken man. Maybe you're right. Maybe I've been too controlling. The silence on the other end stretched for several seconds before Linda responded, her tone cautiously optimistic. Bob, I'm so glad you're being reasonable about this. All I want is what's fair. I know, sweetheart. I know. Bob closed his eyes, picturing her smug expression. Can you bring the will tomorrow? I'm ready to sign everything. Of course. Oh, Bob, you're making the right decision. For all of us. After ending the call, Bob immediately dialed Tommy Rodriguez. Phase 2 starts now. I need you to make Derek Thompson an offer he can't refuse. What kind of offer, boss? The Morrison Project needs a new architectural consultant. The existing firm just had a family emergency. Bob's smile was predatory. Tell Thompson that Mitchell Construction wants to hire him for the entire development. 18 months of work, $3 million in fees. But the contract has to be signed today. You want me to make Derek Thompson rich. I want Derek Thompson exactly where I can control him. Trust me, Tommy. This is going to hurt him a lot more than it helps him. Meanwhile, Rick Morrison was implementing the second part of Bob's strategy. Using contacts in various city departments, Rick had been quietly investigating every permit, every inspection, every document associated with both Mitchell Construction and Thompson Architectural Design. What he'd found was exactly what Bob had hoped for. Derek Thompson had been cutting corners for years, falsified inspection reports, substandard materials, permits obtained through bribery. More importantly, he'd been doing it on projects that Linda had specifically recommended to Bob over the past 18 months. Projects where Mitchell Construction's reputation had been used as cover for Thompson's illegal activities. "Bob," Rick said during their encrypted phone call, "I've got enough evidence to put Thompson away for 20 years. Building code violations, fraud, endangering public safety, the works. But here's the interesting part. Linda's fingerprints are all over these deals. She was the one who brought Thompson to your attention. She was the one who recommended him for the projects where he cut corners. So they've been planning this for almost 2 years. It gets worse. Remember Linda's third husband, the one who died of a heart attack? I tracked down his former business partner. Guy says Thompson was working on their landscaping projects right before the husband got sick. Same pattern, slow poisoning, convenient death. Linda inherits everything." Bob felt the rage crystallize into cold calculation. "Rick, I need you to compile everything into 2 separate packages. One goes to the FBI's white-collar crime division. The other goes to me. When do you want me to deliver them?" "The FBI gets theirs after Linda signs the will tomorrow. I want her feeling completely secure when the hammer falls." The next morning, Linda arrived at the hospital with Derek Thompson in tow. Bob had been expecting this. Linda's arrogance wouldn't let her resist showing off her new life to the man she was destroying. Derek stayed in the hallway while Linda entered with a notary, but Bob could see him through the open door, already counting his money. "I'm so proud of you for making this decision, Bob," Linda said, watching as he signed document after document. "This is what's best for everyone." Bob's signature was steady and strong, the signature of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. "You're right, Linda. This is exactly what everyone deserves." As a notary sealed the last document, Bob made his final play. "Linda, I want to apologize for being so suspicious yesterday. The medication makes me paranoid sometimes. In fact, I want to make it up to you." "Bob, you don't need to. I've decided to give Derek Thompson the Morrison project. $3 million in architectural fees. Consider it my wedding gift to both of you." Linda's face went through several expressions: confusion, suspicion, then greed. "Bob, that's incredibly generous. Derek's been waiting in the hallway, hasn't he? Why don't you bring him in? I'll tell him personally." 5 minutes later, Derek Thompson was shaking Bob's hand and signing a contract that would, in his mind, make him rich. What Derek didn't know was that the contract contained clauses that would make him personally liable for any building code violations discovered during the project. Clauses that would void his payment if any of his previous work was found to be fraudulent. Clauses that would give Mitchell Construction the right to seize all of Thompson Architectural's assets as compensation for damages. "Derek, I want you to start immediately," Bob said, his voice warm with false camaraderie. "In fact, I insist you begin site preparation tomorrow. Time is money in this business." After they left, Bob made 3 phone calls. The first was to Marcus Webb, telling him to file the backdated will immediately. The second was to Rick Morrison, giving him the green light to contact the FBI. The third was to Joey Torino. "Joey, it's time. I need Derek Thompson to disappear for exactly 72 hours. Make sure he can't contact anyone, can't access his phone or computer. But I need him alive and unharmed. This has to look like he chose to disappear. Where do you want him to reappear?" "In a federal holding cell would be perfect." As Bob hung up, he felt a grim satisfaction. Linda thought she'd won. Derek thought he was about to become rich. Amy thought she'd secured her inheritance. They were all about to learn that Bob Mitchell didn't just build buildings. He built traps. And once he were caught in one of his traps, the only way out was through him. And Bob Mitchell wasn't feeling particularly merciful. Chapter 5. The Trap Closes. Derek Thompson never made it to the Morrison Project site. At 6:47 a.m., as he stepped out of his Lincoln Park apartment building, 2 men in a gray van approached him with the efficiency of professionals. By 7:15 a.m., Derek was in a windowless room in an abandoned warehouse on the south side, duct taped to a chair with his cell phone and laptop sitting just out of reach. "Nothing personal, Mr. Thompson," said the larger of the two men, a mountain of muscle named Carlo who worked occasionally for Joey Torino. You're just going to be our guest for a few days. Think of it as a vacation for making bad decisions. While Derek stared at his captors in confused terror, Bob was implementing the next phase of his plan from his hospital bed. Using his laptop, he accessed the Morrison Project's digital files and began making subtle changes to the architectural specifications Derek had already submitted. Foundation depths were reduced by crucial inches. Steel reinforcement was replaced with cheaper alternatives. Fire suppression systems were simplified to the point of uselessness. Every change was traced back to Derek Thompson's digital signature and authenticated with his access codes. Codes that Tommy Rodriguez had obtained by briefly borrowing Derek's laptop during the contract signing the previous day. At noon, Bob received a call from the Morrison Project's head foreman. Mr. Mitchell, we've got problems with the Thompson architectural plans. These specs are dangerous. The foundation won't support the building weight, and the fire systems won't pass inspection. That's impossible, Bob said, injecting perfect confusion into his voice. Derek Thompson is one of the best architects in the city. Double-check those specifications. Sir, I've been in construction for 20 years. These plans are either incompetent or deliberately sabotaged. If we build according to these specs, people are going to die. Stop all work immediately. I'm calling an emergency meeting with the city inspector and the architectural review board. And give me everything Thompson submitted in writing. By 2 p.m., the story was spreading through Chicago's construction community like wildfire. Derek Thompson, the architect who just signed the biggest contract of his career, had submitted plans so dangerous they bordered on homicidal. Worse, when officials tried to contact Thompson for an explanation, he'd vanished without a trace. Linda's first call came at 2:30 p.m. Bob, something's wrong with Derek. He was supposed to meet me for lunch, but he never showed up. His office says he never came in this morning. That's strange, Bob replied, his voice heavy with concern. Maybe there's been an accident? Have you tried calling the hospitals? I've called everywhere. Bob, I'm scared. What if something happened to him? I'm sure he's fine, honey. Maybe he just needed some time to think. Starting a project this big can be overwhelming. At 4 p.m., Bob received another call, this one from FBI Special Agent Sarah Chun, who Rick Morrison had contacted with the evidence of Derek's previous fraudulent activities. Mr. Mitchell, we need to discuss some serious irregularities we've discovered regarding Thompson architectural design and several projects involving your company. Of course, Agent Chun. Though I have to tell you, we're already dealing with some concerns about Mr. Thompson's work. My foreman discovered some dangerous specifications in his current project plans. Sir, based on our investigation, Mr. Thompson has been involved in systematic fraud for the past 3 years. We have evidence of falsified inspection reports, bribery of city officials, and construction practices that have put dozens of buildings at risk. Bob let the appropriate amount of shock creep into his voice. Agent Chun, are you telling me my company has been associated with criminal activity? We believe you and your company have been victims, Mr. Mitchell. Mr. Thompson appears to have used Mitchell Construction's reputation to cover his illegal activities. We'd like to interview you as soon as you're released from the hospital. After ending the call, Bob allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. Derek Thompson was trapped in a web of his own making, or rather, a web that looked like his own making. Even when Derek reappeared in 3 days, he'd be facing federal charges that would keep him occupied for years. But Derek was only half the target. Linda was the real prize, and she was walking into Bob's trap with the confidence of someone who thought she'd already won. At 6 p.m., Linda arrived at the hospital in a state of carefully controlled panic. Bob, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Of course, sweetheart. What's wrong? Did you know about Derek's problems before you gave him the Morrison contract? Bob studied his wife's face, noting the way her hands trembled slightly as she asked the question. What problems? The FBI came to see me this afternoon. They're saying Derek has been involved in fraud, that he's been using your company's name to cover up illegal construction practices. Linda's voice cracked with what sounded like genuine emotion. Bob, they're asking if I knew about any of it. Linda, I had no idea. Derek seemed completely professional when I met him. His references were excellent, His portfolio was impressive. Bob let his voice trail off in apparent confusion. Wait, you've met with Derek before yesterday, haven't you? When you recommended him for those smaller projects last year? The question hung in the air like a loaded gun. Linda's face went through several micro-expressions before settling on wounded innocence. I met him at a few business functions. I thought he was talented, so I mentioned him to you. That's all. Of course, honey. I'm not suggesting anything inappropriate. Bob reached out with his good hand and touched Linda's arm. But the FBI might ask you about those recommendations. They might want to understand how Derek got access to our projects. Linda pulled her arm away slightly. Bob, you're making me nervous. Are you implying that I'm somehow involved in Derek's problems? Not at all. I'm just saying we need to be prepared for difficult questions. The FBI will want to understand every connection between our family and Derek Thompson. As Linda left that evening, Bob could see the fear beginning to replace her confidence. She was starting to realize that her association with Derek wasn't just a liability. It was a noose that was slowly tightening around her neck. The next morning, Bob received a visit from Amy. His daughter looked haggard, as if she hadn't slept in days. Dad, I need to tell you something, she said, closing the hospital room door behind her. About the will, about Linda, about everything. Bob waited, letting his daughter struggle with her conscience. Linda told me you were going to leave everything to charity. She said if I helped convince you to sign the new will, she'd make sure I got enough money for college and graduate school. Amy's voice was barely above a whisper. I knew it was wrong, but I was scared about my future, about having enough money. Amy, what exactly did Linda ask you to do? She wanted me to support her when she said you needed to update your will immediately. She said if we waited, you might change your mind. Amy's hand shook as she continued. But Dad, there's something else. Linda's been putting something in your coffee for months. She said it was supplements to help with your stress, but what, Amy? I saw the bottle she was using. I looked them up online. Dad, I think she's been poisoning you. Bob felt a mixture of rage and relief. Amy had finally found her conscience, but the confession came too late to prevent the damage that was already in motion. Amy, I need you to do something for me. I need you to write down everything you just told me, and I need you to sign it. Can you do that? Will it help put Linda in prison? Amy, it might be the only thing that saves both our lives. As his daughter wrote her confession, Bob realized that the trap he'd set was working perfectly. Derek was neutralized, Linda was panicking, and now Amy was providing the final piece of evidence he needed. The game was almost over, and Bob Mitchell had played it flawlessly. Chapter 6, The Reckoning Begins. Derek Thompson reappeared exactly 72 hours after his disappearance, stumbling out of the abandoned warehouse with a story that no one would believe. He claimed he'd been kidnapped by two men who'd held him without explanation, then released him with a warning to reconsider his life choices. By the time Derek reached his apartment, FBI agents were waiting with arrest warrants. The charges read like a prosecutor's dream: conspiracy to defraud, falsification of government documents, endangering public safety, and racketeering. The evidence was overwhelming: digital records, witness statements, and financial documents that painted Derek as the mastermind of a construction fraud scheme spanning 3 years. This is impossible, Derek told his court-appointed attorney during their first meeting. Someone's setting me up. Bob Mitchell is behind this. He's trying to destroy me. Mr. Thompson, the evidence against you includes your own digital signatures, financial records from your bank accounts, and testimony from city inspectors who say you bribed them. Unless you're claiming that Bob Mitchell somehow traveled back in time to frame you for crimes committed over the past 3 years, your conspiracy theory doesn't hold water. What Derek couldn't know was that Bob had been planning this destruction for months, ever since Tommy Rodriguez's investigation had uncovered Derek's affair with Linda. Every fraudulent activity Derek had committed over the past 3 years had been carefully documented by Rick Morrison. Every illegal shortcut had been photographed. Every bribed official had been identified and turned. Bob hadn't framed Derek Thompson. He'd simply gathered evidence of Derek's existing crimes and packaged them for federal prosecution at the perfect moment. Meanwhile, Linda was discovering that her association with Derek was becoming radioactive. The FBI's investigation had expanded to include anyone who'd worked closely with Thompson Architectural Design, and Linda's name appeared on dozens of documents recommending Derek for various projects. On Thursday morning, FBI agent Sarah Chun arrived at the Mitchell home with a warrant to search the premises. Linda watched in growing horror as agents confiscated her computer, her cell phone, and boxes of financial records. When they found the garden shed containing 3 fully grown foxglove plants and a small chemistry set, Linda's face went white. "Mrs. Mitchell, can you explain why you have equipment for extracting plant compounds in your garden shed?" Agent Chen asked, her voice professionally neutral. I don't know anything about that. Derek must have left it there. He was always interested in landscaping. According to our investigation, Mr. Thompson hasn't been to your home in the past 6 months. These plants were cultivated over a much longer period. Linda's attorney, a nervous man named Peterson, whom she'd hired that morning, stepped forward. "My client doesn't have to answer any more questions." "That's all right," Agent Chen replied. "But I should inform you that we've obtained warrants for Mrs. Mitchell's medical records, insurance policies, and financial statements. We're also interviewing her stepdaughter, who claims to have information about Mrs. Mitchell's activities over the past several months." At the hospital, Bob was putting the finishing touches on his masterpiece. Marcus Webb had successfully filed the backdated will, which left Bob's entire estate to the Chicago Children's Hospital Foundation. The document was dated 8 months earlier, well before any of the suspicious insurance policies or power of attorney documents had been signed. "Marcus, what happens to the will Linda thinks she benefited from? Since your previous will predates all the documents she had you sign, her will becomes invalid. She gets nothing, well, except whatever's covered in her prenuptial agreement." Bob smiled grimly. Linda's prenup, which she'd signed eagerly 12 years ago when she thought Bob's assets were worth far less than they actually were, entitled her to exactly $50,000 and no claim on Mitchell Construction. What about the power of attorney documents? Also invalid. Since they were signed after your legitimate will, they can be challenged as products of undue influence or incapacity, especially now that we have Amy's confession about the poisoning. Dr. Ramirez entered the room as Marcus was leaving, carrying Bob's discharge papers and a grim expression. "Bob, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." "What is it, doctor?" "Did you know your wife was poisoning you before you came to the hospital?" The question caught Bob off guard. He'd been so focused on his revenge that he hadn't considered how his actions might appear to outside observers. "What makes you ask that?" "Because your blood work shows that you stopped ingesting digitalis 3 days before your stroke. The timing suggests you either identified the poison and stopped consuming it, or someone warned you about it." Dr. Ramirez sat down, studying Bob's face. "The other possibility is that your wife stopped poisoning you because she thought you were going to die anyway." Bob considered his response carefully. "Doctor, I can honestly say that I had no idea Linda was poisoning me until you told me. The fact that the poisoning stopped before my stroke is something you'd have to ask her about." It was technically true. Bob hadn't known about the digitalis specifically until Dr. Ramirez told him. He'd only suspected that something was wrong with his coffee, which was why he'd switched to drinking tea that final week. "Bob, there's something else. The FBI has asked me to testify about your medical condition and the poisoning. They want to establish a timeline for attempted murder charges. Will you testify?" "I have to. But Bob, I need you to understand something. If you knew about the poisoning and didn't report it immediately, that could complicate things legally." Bob nodded, understanding the implicit warning. Dr. Ramirez suspected that he'd orchestrated at least part of the revenge against Linda and Derek, but she couldn't prove it. As long as Bob maintained plausible deniability, her testimony would focus on the medical evidence rather than his potential involvement in bringing down his enemies. That evening, as Bob prepared to leave the hospital, he received 2 final pieces of good news. The first came from Tommy Rodriguez. "Boss, Linda just tried to withdraw $200,000 from the joint checking account. Bank froze the transaction pending FBI investigation. She's got about $500 in cash and whatever's in her personal account." The second came from Rick Morrison. "Bob, Derek Thompson's attorney, just approached the FBI about a plea deal. Seems Derek wants to testify against Linda in exchange for a reduced sentence. He's claiming she was the mastermind behind the whole operation. Bob smiled as he signed his discharge papers. Derek and Linda were turning on each other exactly as he'd hoped they would. Their alliance, built on greed and betrayal, was crumbling under the pressure of federal investigation and mutual self-interest. The trap had closed perfectly. Now all that remained was watching his enemies destroy each other while he reclaimed everything they tried to steal. Bob Mitchell was going home, and he was going home as the victor in a war that Linda and Derek never realized they were fighting until it was far too late. Chapter 7. The Hammer Falls. Linda Mitchell's arrest came at dawn on Friday morning, executed with the theatrical precision that federal agents reserved for high-profile cases. As the handcuffs clicked around her wrists in her own driveway, neighbors emerged to witness the spectacle of the woman who'd played grieving wife for months being charged with attempted murder. Linda Walsh Mitchell, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, attempted murder, insurance fraud, and racketeering, Agent Shin announced, her voice carrying across the suburban silence. You have the right to remain silent. Bob watched the arrest from Tommy Rodriguez's car, parked 3 blocks away. He'd been discharged from the hospital that morning, but instead of going home, he'd chosen to witness the moment his wife's world collapsed. The satisfaction was profound and surgical, not the hot rage of revenge, but the cold pleasure of justice perfectly executed. Derek Thompson's plea bargain had provided the final pieces of evidence the FBI needed. Under pressure and facing 20 years in federal prison, Derek had confessed to everything. The systematic poisoning of Bob, the forged documents, the insurance fraud scheme, and Linda's role as the architect of the entire plan. She planned everything, Derek had told federal prosecutors during his cooperation interview. Linda researched the digitalis extraction. Linda identified which documents needed to be forged. Linda even chose the timing of when to increase the doses to trigger the stroke. I was just following her lead. Derek's confession painted Linda as a serial killer who'd perfected her methods over 4 marriages. The FBI had reopened investigations into the deaths of Linda's 3 previous husbands, and preliminary evidence suggested a pattern of slow poisoning followed by convenient deaths and substantial inheritances. But Derek's betrayal came with a price that Bob had specifically engineered. As part of his plea agreement, Derek was required to forfeit all assets obtained through criminal activity, which included the $3 million from the Morrison Project. Since the contract had contained clauses voiding payment for fraudulent work, Derek lost both his freedom and his potential windfall. Amy's testimony provided the emotional foundation for the prosecution's case. Bob's daughter broke down on the witness stand as she described watching Linda add mysterious substances to Bob's coffee, being pressured to manipulate her father into signing documents he hadn't reviewed, and gradually realizing that her stepmother was systematically murdering her father. I was scared and confused, Amy testified, tears streaming down her face. Linda told me that Dad was sick and might not make good decisions about money. She made it sound like we were protecting him, but I knew something was wrong. I just didn't want to believe that someone could be so evil. The media coverage was brutal and comprehensive. Chicago Tribune headlines screamed, "Black Widow. Local woman charged in husband's attempted murder." The Chicago Sun-Times ran a series investigating Linda's previous marriages, uncovering a trail of dead husbands and suspicious circumstances that stretched back 15 years. For Bob, watching from his home as his wife's reputation crumbled was therapeutic in ways that surprised him. He'd expected to feel vindicated, but what he actually felt was a profound sense of closure, as if a cancer had been surgically removed from his life. The financial devastation was equally complete. Linda's assets had been frozen pending investigation. Her legal bills were mounting exponentially, and her attorney had already indicated that she couldn't afford his continued representation. Meanwhile, Bob's carefully orchestrated legal strategy had protected every penny of his legitimate wealth. Marcus Webb had filed motions to invalidate every document Linda had coerced Bob into signing, citing evidence of undue influence and incapacity caused by systematic poisoning. The backdated will was holding up under scrutiny, partly because Bob had been meticulous about creating a paper trail of his charitable intentions dating back several years. Bob, the prenup is ironclad, Marcus explained during their victory meeting. Linda gets her $50,000 and nothing else. The house, the business, the investments, everything stays with you. What about Amy? Since Linda isn't Amy's biological mother, she has no legal standing to claim anything on Amy's behalf. Your daughter inherits according to your legitimate will, which currently leaves her a substantial trust fund when she turns 25. The psychological warfare was equally devastating. Bob had Tommy Rodriguez deliver a box to Linda's jail cell containing copies of all the surveillance footage, financial records, and evidence that had been gathered against her. The message was clear. Bob had been watching, planning, and preparing for this moment long before Linda realized she was in danger. The package included a single note in Bob's handwriting. You taught me that trust is a weapon. I learned the lesson well. Derek Thompson's imprisonment was almost anticlimactic by comparison. His guilty plea earned him 8 years in federal prison, forfeiture of all assets, and permanent disbarment from architectural practice. But the real punishment was watching Linda systematically destroy his credibility during her own defense. Derek Thompson is a weak, manipulative man who exploited my emotional vulnerability after my husband's stroke, Linda's new attorney argued during bail hearings. Ms. Mitchell was a victim of Mr. Thompson's manipulation, not a co-conspirator in his crimes. The strategy backfired spectacularly when prosecutors presented evidence of Linda's previous marriages and the suspicious deaths of her former husbands. Derek's manipulation defense became irrelevant when faced with evidence that Linda had been perfecting murder techniques for over a decade. Bob's recovery from his stroke was remarkably swift once the poisoning stopped. Within 2 weeks of Linda's arrest, his speech had returned to normal, his motor functions had fully recovered, and his energy levels were higher than they'd been in months. Dr. Ramirez attributed the rapid improvement to the cessation of digitalis toxicity, but Bob knew the truth. Rage was a powerful medicine, and revenge was the most effective therapy. The business implications were equally positive. Mitchell Construction's reputation had actually benefited from the scandal. Bob was portrayed as the victim of an elaborate criminal conspiracy, a successful businessman nearly destroyed by the woman he trusted most. Clients who might have been concerned about the company's stability instead saw Bob as a survivor who'd overcome incredible adversity. The Morrison project was reassigned to a reputable architectural firm, and construction resumed within a month. Other developers, impressed by Bob's handling of the crisis, began approaching Mitchell Construction with new opportunities. By the end of the quarter, the company was booking more projects than it had in the previous year. But the most satisfying moment came when Amy approached Bob with a request that demonstrated how completely the family dynamics had shifted. "Dad, I want to change my last name back to Mitchell," she said during one of their weekly dinners. "I know I was born a Mitchell, but after everything that happened, I want to make it official again. I want to make it clear that I'm your daughter, not Linda's." Bob studied Amy's face, seeing determination where there had once been uncertainty. "Amy, you never stopped being my daughter, not even when you made mistakes. I know, but I need to make this right. I need to show everyone, and myself, that I choose to be a Mitchell, that I choose to be someone you can be proud of." The legal name change was finalized 2 weeks later, on the same day that Linda's bail was revoked due to new evidence suggesting she might flee the country. As Amy signed the documents restoring her original name, Bob felt something he hadn't experienced in months: genuine happiness. The war was essentially over. Linda faced life in prison. Derek was already serving his sentence, and Amy had proven that blood was stronger than bribery. Bob had lost a wife, but he'd gained something more valuable: the absolute certainty that he could trust his own instincts about who deserved his loyalty. And he'd proven that Bob Mitchell was not a man who could be betrayed with impunity. Chapter 8. The Reckoning Complete. 6 months after Linda's arrest, her trial began with the kind of media circus usually reserved for celebrities or politicians. Dubbed the Black Widow trial by every major news outlet, The case had captured national attention as a symbol of domestic betrayal taken to its logical extreme. Bob attended every day of testimony, sitting in the front row with the quiet intensity of a man watching his life's work vindicated. He'd lost 30 pounds during the poisoning, but in the months since Linda's arrest, he'd regained his strength and more. At 43, he looked harder and more dangerous than he had in years. The face of a man who'd survived attempted murder and emerged stronger. The prosecution's case was devastating in its completeness. Dr. Ramirez testified about the systematic poisoning, explaining how digitalis had been administered in carefully calculated doses designed to cause progressive organ failure. Amy took the stand for 3 days, describing in excruciating detail how Linda had manipulated her into participating in what she now realized was a murder plot. But the testimony that destroyed Linda's defense came from an unexpected source: Maria Santos, Linda's cleaning lady for the past 2 years. Maria had been keeping detailed records of everything she'd observed, partly out of suspicion and partly out of protective instinct toward Bob. She was always very careful about Mr. Mitchell's coffee. Maria testified in accented but clear English. She would make it herself every morning, and she would add things from small bottles she kept in her bathroom. When I asked what they were, she said they were vitamins for Mr. Mitchell's health. Did you ever see these bottles? Yes. I saw her preparing the coffee many times. She would grind some kind of plant material, it looked like dried flowers, and mix it with liquid from the bottles. She told me never to touch Mr. Mitchell's coffee cup. That was very important. He'd drink everything she prepared. Maria's testimony was particularly damaging because she'd taken photographs of the bottles and the plant material with her cell phone, thinking she might need evidence if something happened to her employer. The photos clearly showed foxglove extract and the makeshift chemistry setup Linda had been using to concentrate the digitalis. Derek Thompson's testimony from prison was delivered via video link, and his appearance shocked even Bob. Prison had aged Derek significantly, his handsome features now gaunt and his confident demeanor replaced by the haunted look of a man who'd realized too late that he'd been used. Linda planned everything, Derek said, his voice barely above a whisper. She researched my background, found out about my financial problems, and approached me with what seemed like a business opportunity. She said Bob was getting old and might make poor decisions about his company, that she needed help protecting their family's assets. When did you realize the true nature of her plan? When she started talking about Bob's health problems and how convenient it would be if his condition worsened. She was very careful never to explicitly say she wanted him dead, but the implications were clear. By then, I was in too deep to back out. Derek's testimony revealed the calculating nature of Linda's approach. She'd seduced him gradually, using sex and the promise of wealth to bind him to her increasingly criminal schemes. Each step had seemed reasonable in isolation, but together they formed a coherent plan to murder Bob and steal his life's work. The defense's strategy centered around portraying Linda as a victim of domestic abuse who'd been driven to desperate measures by Bob's controlling behavior. Linda's attorney, an expensive criminal lawyer named Harrison, whom her family had hired, painted a picture of a woman trapped in a loveless marriage with a man who monitored her every move. My client was isolated, controlled, and psychologically abused for years, Harrison argued during opening statements. She was driven to seek companionship elsewhere, and when she found it, she was manipulated by Derek Thompson into participating in schemes she didn't fully understand. The strategy might have worked with a different defendant, but Linda's history of previous marriages destroyed any credibility her domestic abuse claims might have had. The prosecution called witnesses from Linda's past who testified about her calculating nature, her obsession with wealthy men, and her pattern of isolating her husbands from friends and family before they died. The most damaging testimony came from Jennifer Walsh, Linda's sister, who'd flown in from Cleveland to testify for the prosecution. Linda always said she was too smart to work for a living. Jennifer testified, her voice heavy with disgust. She studied wealthy men the way other people study for college exams. She'd researched their backgrounds, their business interests, their family situations. She called it husband hunting, but it was really more like hunting prey. Did she ever discuss her marriages with you? She bragged about them. After her second husband died, she told me that accidents happen to people who don't appreciate what they have. After the third one died, she said she'd perfected the art of being a widow. Jennifer's testimony was particularly devastating because she produced recordings of phone conversations she'd had with Linda over the years. In one recording, made just 3 months before Bob's stroke, Linda could be heard saying, "Bob's getting suspicious about some of the financial changes I've been making. I might need to accelerate the timeline." The prosecution's closing argument was delivered by Assistant U.S. Attorney Patricia Moore, a veteran prosecutor who'd built her career on complex financial crimes. Moore methodically walked the jury through Linda's pattern of behavior, connecting the dots between her previous marriages and her attempt to murder Bob. Linda Mitchell is not a victim, Moore declared, her voice carrying the authority of absolute certainty. She is a predator who has spent 15 years perfecting the art of murder for profit. She poisoned Robert Mitchell slowly and systematically, not in a moment of passion or desperation, but as part of a calculated plan to steal everything he'd worked to build. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts: attempted murder, conspiracy to commit murder, insurance fraud, and racketeering. The speed of their decision reflected the overwhelming nature of the evidence against Linda. Judge William Harrison, no relation to Linda's attorney, sentenced Linda to life in prison without the possibility of parole, citing the premeditated nature of her crimes and the pattern of behavior extending across multiple marriages. Mrs. Mitchell, you have shown a complete disregard for human life and a level of calculation that suggests you pose a permanent danger to society, Judge Harrison declared as he handed down the sentence. Your crimes represent not a momentary lapse in judgment, but a sustained pattern of predatory behavior that has destroyed multiple families. Linda's reaction to the sentence was the first genuine emotion she'd shown during the entire trial. As the bailiff moved to take her into custody, she turned toward Bob with an expression of pure hatred. "You think you've won?" she screamed, her composed facade finally cracking. "You think you're better than me? You're a cold, calculating bastard who destroys everyone who crosses him. We're exactly the same." Bob met her gaze steadily, his expression completely calm. "No, Linda, we're nothing alike. I build things. You destroy them. I earned everything I have. You tried to steal it." As Linda was led away in handcuffs, Bob felt the last vestiges of any emotion he'd ever felt for her drain away. She wasn't his wife anymore. She wasn't even human in any meaningful sense. She was simply a problem that had been solved, a threat that had been neutralized. The civil implications of Linda's conviction were equally satisfying. Marcus Webb had filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Linda's estate, such as it was, and Derek Thompson, seeking damages for the attempted murder and the business losses caused by their criminal conspiracy. The judgments would ensure that neither Linda nor Derek would ever profit from their crimes, even if they somehow gained early release. Amy's reaction to the verdict was more complex. She'd testified against Linda, but Bob could see that the experience had left emotional scars that would take years to heal. "Dad, I keep thinking about how easily I was manipulated," Amy said during dinner the night after the sentencing. "I was so focused on money, on securing my future, that I almost helped someone murder my own father." Amy, you're 19 years old and dealing with someone who'd spent years perfecting the art of manipulation. The important thing is that you found your conscience in time to do the right thing. But what if I hadn't? What if I'd stayed quiet and let her kill you? Bob studied his daughter's face, seeing genuine remorse and a maturity that hadn't been there 6 months earlier. "Amy, I can't answer what-if questions. All I can tell you is that when the moment came, you chose to do the right thing. That's what defines who you are, not the mistakes you almost made, but the choices you actually made." The conversation marked a turning point in their relationship. Amy had proven that she could be trusted when it mattered most, and Bob had proven that his love for his daughter was stronger than his disappointment in her temporary weakness. The business implications of the trial were overwhelmingly positive. Mitchell Construction had received millions of dollars in free publicity, all of it portraying Bob as a victim who'd overcome incredible adversity. The company's reputation for integrity had actually been enhanced by the scandal, and new projects were being signed faster than Bob could hire crews to handle them. But the most satisfying aspect of his victory wasn't financial, it was personal. Bob had proven to himself and everyone else that Robert Mitchell wasn't a man who could be betrayed with impunity. He'd taken a coordinated attack designed to destroy him and turned it into the complete annihilation of his enemies. Linda would spend the rest of her life in prison. Derek had lost everything and would emerge from jail as a middle-aged ex-convict with no prospects. Amy had learned that actions have consequences and that family loyalty was more valuable than any amount of money. And Bob Mitchell had emerged stronger, richer, and more dangerous than ever. The war was over, and Bob had won so completely that his enemies would serve as warnings to anyone else who might consider crossing him in the future. Chapter 9. Phoenix Rising. 1 year after Linda's conviction, Bob Mitchell stood in the penthouse office of the newly completed Morrison Tower, looking out over the Chicago skyline he'd helped reshape over the past 2 decades. The building was the largest project in Mitchell Construction's history. 42 stories of luxury condominiums and commercial space that had become the crown jewel of the city's architectural landscape. The past year had been a period of unprecedented growth and success. The publicity from Linda's trial had made Bob something of a celebrity in Chicago's business community, the man who'd survived attempted murder and emerged stronger than ever. Fortune magazine had profiled him as one of the city's most resilient entrepreneurs, and Harvard Business School had invited him to speak about crisis management and business ethics. But the most significant change wasn't professional, it was personal. Bob had discovered that surviving a murder attempt and orchestrating the complete destruction of his enemies had burned away every trace of weakness or sentimentality from his character. He was harder now, more focused, more ruthlessly efficient in both business and personal relationships. Amy had thrived under his new approach to parenting. Instead of the permissive father who'd once worried about her feelings, Bob had become a demanding mentor who expected excellence and accountability. Amy was now a junior at Northwestern, majoring in business administration and maintaining a 3.9 GPA. More importantly, she developed the kind of character that Bob respected: direct, honest, and completely loyal to family. Dad, the Morrison project is officially complete and fully occupied, Amy reported, reviewing the project files she'd been helping to organize as part of her internship at Mitchell Construction. The commercial spaces are leased at 98% capacity, and the residential units sold out before construction was finished. What about the final profit margins? 37% above projections. The publicity from everything that happened actually drove up demand. People wanted to live in a building associated with your story. Bob nodded, unsurprised. Americans loved a comeback story, and his personal narrative, successful businessman nearly destroyed by evil wife, fights back to achieve greater success than ever, was perfectly calibrated for the cultural moment. The financial numbers were staggering. Mitchell Construction had grown by 400% in the past year, expanding from a regional player to a company bidding on projects across the Midwest. Bob's personal net worth had tripled, making him one of the wealthiest self-made entrepreneurs in Chicago. But money had never been the real prize. The real prize was the absolute certainty that Bob Mitchell was untouchable, that anyone who tried to betray or destroy him would face consequences so severe that they'd serve as warnings to future enemies. Derek Thompson had been released from prison after serving 18 months, his sentence reduced for cooperation. But his cooperation had come at a price that would follow him for the rest of his life. Derek's testimony had been so complete, so devastating to Linda's defense, that he'd essentially confessed to every detail of their criminal conspiracy on national television. Tommy Rodriguez's monthly reports on Derek's post-prison life made for entertaining reading. Derek was living in a studio apartment in Cleveland, working as a night shift security guard and struggling to pay his legal bills. His architectural license had been permanently revoked, his credit was destroyed, and his criminal record made him unemployable in any field requiring trust or responsibility. Derek Thompson called the office again yesterday, Tommy reported during their weekly security briefing. 10th time this month. Says he wants to apologize to you personally. What did you tell him? Same thing I always tell him. That Mr. Mitchell doesn't take calls from convicted felons. But boss, the guy sounds desperate. Prison broke him completely. Bob felt nothing resembling sympathy. Derek had made his choices when he decided to help murder an innocent man for money. The consequences of those choices would follow Derek for the rest of his life, exactly as Bob had intended. Linda's fate was even more satisfying. Life in prison had stripped away every trace of the sophisticated woman who'd once manipulated wealthy men for sport. Tommy's contacts in the federal prison system reported that Linda had aged dramatically, her health declining rapidly under the stress of confinement and the constant threat of violence from other inmates. Linda Mitchell is in protective custody most of the time now, Tommy reported. Other inmates don't like women who kill their husbands. She's been attacked twice, and the guards think she won't survive another general population incident. Is she still trying to appeal her conviction? Her family stopped paying for lawyers 6 months ago. She's representing herself now, filing handwritten motions that the courts reject immediately. The appeals process is essentially over. Bob nodded, feeling a grim satisfaction. Linda would spend the next 30 or 40 years watching her beauty fade, her health decline, and her life waste away in a concrete box. It was exactly what she deserved for trying to steal everything Bob had built. The psychological impact of his victory extended far beyond his enemies. Bob's reputation in Chicago's business community had evolved from successful contractor to dangerous man who shouldn't be crossed. Competitors were more respectful, clients were more deferential, and potential business partners approached him with the kind of caution usually reserved for dangerous animals. Bob cultivated this reputation deliberately. During business negotiations, he would sometimes mention Linda's conviction casually, letting his counterparts understand that Robert Mitchell was not a man who forgave betrayal or forgot injuries. The psychological advantage was enormous. People who might have tried to cheat him in the past now bent over backward to ensure their dealings were scrupulously honest. The personal relationships in Bob's life had also been transformed. He'd eliminated every friendship that hadn't proven itself during the crisis, cutting off people who'd been sympathetic to Linda or who'd questioned his handling of the situation. The friends who remained were absolutely loyal, understanding that Bob's friendship was a privilege that could be revoked permanently for any sign of disloyalty. Romance was not a priority. Several attractive, successful women had made their interests clear, but Bob felt no desire to remarry or even to pursue serious relationships. The experience with Linda had taught him that emotional vulnerability was a weakness that could be exploited by enemies. He preferred to remain unattached, invulnerable to the kind of intimate betrayal that had almost destroyed him. Dr. Ramirez had become more than Bob's physician. She'd become something approaching a friend. During his quarterly checkups, she would ask about his emotional recovery as well as his physical health. Bob, you made an extraordinary recovery from both the poisoning and the psychological trauma, she said during his most recent visit. But I have to ask, are you happy? The question caught Bob off guard. Happiness wasn't something he'd considered in months. I'm satisfied, he replied after some thought. I'm successful. My daughter is thriving. My enemies have been destroyed, and my business is more profitable than ever. If that's not happiness, it's something close enough. But what about companionship? What about love? Bob considered the question seriously. Dr. Ramirez, I loved Linda. I trusted her completely, and she tried to murder me for money. That kind of betrayal changes a man fundamentally. I'm not sure I'm capable of that kind of vulnerability anymore. And you're comfortable with that? I'm comfortable with being safe. I'm comfortable with being in control. If the price of that security is loneliness, it's a price I'm willing to pay. As Bob left the hospital that day, he reflected on the past year and the person he'd become. The old Bob Mitchell had been successful, but vulnerable, trusting, but naive. The new Bob Mitchell was harder, colder, more calculating, but also more effective and infinitely more dangerous. The transformation was complete and irreversible. Bob had been forged in the fire of betrayal and attempted murder, and what had emerged was something stronger and more ruthless than what had gone in. Standing in his penthouse office as the sun set over Chicago, Bob Mitchell felt the deep satisfaction of a man who had won the most important battle of his life. His enemies were destroyed, his empire was stronger than ever, and his reputation would protect him from future betrayals. He'd learned the most important lesson a man could learn: that mercy was weakness, that forgiveness was vulnerability, and that the only way to truly protect yourself was to make the consequences of betraying you so severe that even thinking about it would terrify potential enemies. Amy knocked on his office door, interrupting his thoughts. "Dad, are you ready for dinner? I made reservations at that new steakhouse downtown." Bob looked at his daughter, the one person in the world who'd earned back his complete trust, and smiled. "Let's go. We have a lot to celebrate." As they left the building together, Bob reflected on the perfect symmetry of his victory. He'd started with everything, lost it all to betrayal, and then taken it back with interest.